The cartel soldiers crouched behind crates, containers, and trucks, their hands shaking as they desperately fired their submachine guns. Bullets tear through the air, explosions rock the compound. Overhead, the thump of helicopter rotors grow louder. It's a battle the cartel can't afford to lose. But this isn't a fight against a rival cartel or even Mexican law enforcement. This is different. This is the full force of the U.S. military. Is there any chance that it could win? We'll reveal what would really happen in today's episode of the Infographic Show. Mexican cartel versus the U.S. military. Who would win? But first, how did we even get here? It all comes down to the Mexican authorities. For almost 20 years, Mexico's police forces, federal officers, and even members of the military have been fighting a war against the cartels. It's a war they aren't winning. Since 2006, the year that the Mexican government officially declared war on the cartels, the country has seen over 460,000 homicides. Even with the U.S. providing billions of dollars to help Mexico overcome the scourge, the violence just doesn't stop. Sure, Mexico has enjoyed some success. When Felipe Calderón announced the war against the cartels, he deployed tens of thousands of Mexico's 412,000 active military personnel to fight for the cause. Those soldiers either supplemented or outright replaced Mexico's local police forces, and they got results. Calderón's military crackdown resulted in 25 of Mexico's 37 top drug kingpins being captured. But therein lies the problem. There was never a shortage of new kingpins ready to rise and take the place of those captured or killed. While Calderón's strategy managed to cripple some of the larger cartels, it also fractured the underworld, leading to smaller, more unpredictable gangs splintering off. They quickly began operating on their own, creating even more chaos. Those smaller gangs are more brutal than the larger cartels that came before. They have to be to keep their drug businesses running. They're also harder to track down because being smaller means they have the flexibility needed to operate under the radar. It also doesn't help that Calderón's successors focused less on attacking the cartels and more on reducing Mexico's massive homicide rates. And that is where the U.S. military comes in. Mexico has convinced the U.S. it can't win the cartel war alone. Now it wants America fully involved, and Washington has answered. The U.S. is committing its full manpower and technological might to the fight, bringing elite forces, advanced surveillance, and cutting-edge weaponry into the war against the cartels. The U.S. has its own reasons to join the fight. Between 90 and 94% of the heroin consumed in the U.S. comes from Mexico. Fentanyl is a massive problem that's killing 55,000 Americans every year. And there's cocaine. Thousands of tons of this dangerous drug cross the Mexican border into the U.S. annually. America wants to crack down on the cartel's drug trade, and Mexico wants to rid itself of the cartels. It's a match made in heaven. And on the surface, the U.S. enters a fight that it should easily win. America is dedicating its entire military to taking out the cartels, bringing a massive manpower advantage to the table. According to Global Firepower, which is a military aggregator that ranks 145 nations based on over 50 factors every year, the U.S. has a staggering 1.3 million active military personnel. It also has plenty of reserves, with almost 800,000 soldiers waiting in the wings for a call-up. If the U.S. fully mobilized against Mexico's cartels, its military strength would surge even further. With the ability to draft an average 4.3 million people per year, the U.S. could rapidly expand its forces, though it likely won't need to go that far. With 1.3 million active duty personnel, the U.S. military is already more than enough. After all, the cartels are much smaller. That's not to say that they're tiny. It's estimated that Mexico's cartels are the country's fifth largest employers, with 175,000 members being divided across dozens of gangs. There are also 1.7 million people in Latin American jails, with the cartel likely to use the influence of its drug money to recruit from those jails as much as it possibly can. That would offer a slow stream of new recruits. The cartels can only sign inmates up after they're released, but it's still a fairly impressive force. But the U.S. could just steamroll into Mexico and wipe out the cartels, right? Well, not quite. Before the U.S. starts actively fighting, it needs to do a lot of careful planning. The cartels may be smaller on the manpower front, but they have some advantages. And the most important of those advantages is something it can utilize against the U.S. Fear. Mexico's cartels don't have the support from the country's people. That was revealed back in 2012, when 80% of people said they supported Mexico's use of its military to take out the cartels. Mexico's people just want to get rid of the drug kingpins that plague their country, which might lead to the U.S. assuming it would have plenty of support as it wages its war. But that is where the fear aspect comes into play. In 2023, the Border Report revealed around 70% of adult residents of the cities of Juarez and Mexico feel unsafe in their cities. The number grows even higher for people in Reynosa. 83% say they feel unsafe. Head to Zacatecas, where warring cartels have hung bodies from bridges and stuffed corpses up to 10 deep inside of cars. and you'll find a staggering 92.1% of residents say they feel unsafe. And that is exactly how the cartels want it. They can use the fear they've generated to control large portions of Mexico's population. Sure, many average Mexicans would have some idea of where the cartels operate, which the US could use when gathering intelligence, but how many are going to talk in detail when they have the threat of being hung from a bridge looming over their heads? The US also can't just go storming in. There are just too many Mexican citizens' lives at stake. Cartel members can easily blend into the cities where they operate. Innocents would be caught in the crossfire. The US approach has to be far more careful. America also has to think about the weapons the cartel has available. Cartels arm themselves by smuggling weapons into Mexico. Though Mexicans have the right to own firearms, all purchases have to be made via a solitary gun shop in Mexico City. That store is controlled by the Mexican army, making it practically impossible for anybody who might have a whiff of being a cartel member to legally get their hands on a gun in Mexico. Even if the cartels had people who could get guns legally, they likely wouldn't want to risk it. Why let your people get arrested and potentially give up intelligence when you can just smuggle weapons into Mexico? And that is just what they do. When it comes to firepower, the cartels have no shortage of deadly weapons. Their arsenals are filled with the usual suspects. AR-15s and AK-47 type rifles are the most common rifles found on the Mexican black market, and most of them come from the US. Modification of those weapons is also common. Back in 2009, Mexican authorities seized more than 4,400 AR-15s and AK-47 type rifles with modifications, most of which turned the firearms into select fire weapons. Those are just the modified weapons seized that year. There are tens of thousands more in the hands of the cartels. Far more dangerous to America's military are the larger weapons the cartels manage to smuggle into Mexico. USA Today reports that a member of the Sinaloa cartel, named El Flaco, says his cartel has access to FGM-148 Javelin guided missile launchers. A single Javelin missile boasts a range of 13,000 feet and features a tandem charge warhead designed to bypass reactive armor before delivering a lethal strike to a tank's core. Those devastating weapons have proven their effectiveness time and time again in battlefields, boasting a 94% engagement success rate. And according to El Flaco, it also has people, including himself, who are trained to use them. Those javelins could have come from anywhere. The US Department of Defense lost 35 javelins during the Iraq War. Maybe some found their way to Mexico. Mexican authorities have also seized Stinger missiles and AT-4 shoulder-mounted anti-tank missile launchers from the cartels in the past. If the cartels had those weapons before, the odds are they have similar firepower. Of course, the US brings plenty of firepower of its own to the fight. It has over 4,600 tanks in its stockpiles, which would easily leave it with thousands in reserve, even if the cartels managed to take out a handful with Javelin missiles. America also brings over 391,000 military vehicles to the war, used for transporting troops and setting up checkpoints and assaulting cartel positions. Add 641 multiple launch rocket systems and nearly 2,000 artillery units into the mix, and the US clearly has the advantage on the land power front. That is without mentioning the thousands of Javelins and powerful M4 carbine rifles that are just standard issue for all of its soldiers. Still, the risks faced by the US military are greater than they might seem. Nowhere is this more evident than when American forces attempt to storm a cartel stronghold. These strongholds contain fortified buildings, but the cartels don't just build equivalents to military bases to defend their most valuable territory. They're set up in small towns and cities that are filled with civilians along with cartel members. That's why the US can't just go rolling in with tanks and armored vehicles. It has to be smarter than that. To take out a cartel stronghold, the US would have to surround one of the towns or cities with its military vehicles. Those vehicles would create checkpoints on all the roads in and out of the location, staffed by American troops, through which no cartel members could cross. It would be a blockade which would enable the US to keep the cartel forces contained. Warnings would also be sent to all the residents of a cartel stronghold. Newscasts and the internet would blare alerts to all citizens to stay in their homes. Schools, local government buildings, and most businesses would also have to go into lockdown. The US would essentially have to shut down an entire city before it begins an assault. Only then would the military vehicle convoys start rolling through the stronghold. Intelligence gathered by the US military would reveal where the most important cartel buildings are in the town or city. The military forces would then roll in and head toward those positions, acting almost like extremely well-armed police officers more than a fighting force. What America's soldiers face when they arrive would depend on the cartel. In some cases, the cartels will make a stand. AR-15s and AK-47 rifle fire would fill the air, along with M4 fire from the American troops. Each assault on a stronghold would be a standoff, with small skirmishes taking place throughout the lockdown city. the cartels would have some minor success. They know their cities better than the American troops, allowing them to create ambushes that take out isolated U.S. vehicles. If the cartel also has access to Javelin missiles, as some do, the U.S. might experience some vehicle and tank losses. But the reality is that these standoffs would almost never go in the cartel's favor. Fighting directly against America's overwhelming forces would lead to cartel losses every single time. It's far smarter to escape to live another day and continue to fight elsewhere. That brings us to a key problem that the U.S. would face when storming a cartel stronghold: escape routes. The cartels are experienced in dealing with military forces thanks to the war waged against them since 2006. Discretion is so often the better part of valor in these fights, which is why the cartels have developed a network of underground tunnels. Some of these tunnels are massive. In 2022, authorities discovered a massive 1,700-foot tunnel connecting the Mexican city of Tijuana to a warehouse in San Diego. The tunnel was 61 feet underground and about 4 feet in diameter. It even had a primitive railway system built into it. The tunnel was used to smuggle drugs into the U.S., but it's also possible that cartel members could use similar tunnels to escape the U.S. military. There are many more examples. Authorities have found several of these tunnels connecting Tijuana to San Diego, and it's safe to assume that there are other smaller examples inside of Mexico that the cartel could use as escape routes. After all, the famed cartel kingpin El Chapo once escaped prison thanks to a 1-mile tunnel his cartel compatriots built. Working on similar tunnels will take place at the cartel strongholds to give gang leaders more routes out of their cities as the U.S. military invades. Still, America has its strategy for dealing with the strongholds, building from Mexican intelligence, along with scraps of information it gets from terrified citizens. It starts creating blockades and conducting raids. Some are successful. The cartel members who stayed behind and fight are usually overwhelmed, and the raids that don't result in victories and gang member captures still scatter cartel members, forcing them to leave behind valuable weapons. The success of this stronghold blockading approach leads the U.S. military to a revelation. It doesn't need to fight against the cartel as though it's dealing with a traditional war. Cutting cartel members off from one another weakens the gangs. Perhaps preventing those gangs from engaging in their illicit businesses will be just as effective. And that's where the U.S. Navy comes into play. The Mexican cartels have navies of sorts. Well, they at least have ships. As Rear Admiral Christopher Tomney of the Joint Insurgency Task Force South of the U.S. Coast Guard revealed in 2015, well over 95% of the drugs are moving on the water. The cartel takes advantage of every vessel it can find to ship drugs into the U.S. Those boats include everything from massive container ships and other non-commercial vessels to sailboats, yachts, and fishing boats. The cartels also take advantage of speedboats that they use to outrun the U.S. Coast Guard, so drugs are successfully delivered to America. The cartels even have primitive submersibles. Built using fiberglass and marine-grade plywood, these small submarines are fitted with commercial engines and cost around $1 million to make. However, they're able to sneak past the U.S. Coast Guard because they're underwater. Of course, there's an obvious problem with this cartel navy. It's designed for sneaking drugs into the U.S. via water. It absolutely isn't built to take on the might of a military navy, and that's where the U.S. has a clear advantage. The U.S. Navy has 440 assets, which have a combined tonnage of 4.5 million. Tonnage is important. The higher it is, the larger the ship being sailed. With the U.S. Navy, there are 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers. The cartels don't have any weapons that they could use to damage those massive ships, meaning the U.S. can easily station them in the waters surrounding Mexico to serve as jump-off points for aerial assaults against cartel positions. More on that later. The U.S. Navy operates 81 destroyers, massive warships built for long-term deployments, capable of staying at sea for months while maintaining constant combat readiness. These vessels are armed with a powerful mix of weaponry, including anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-surface systems, as well as long-range missiles designed to engage and destroy enemy ships before they even see the threat coming. Add 26 corvettes to that mix, which are smaller than the destroyers, and you get a potent surface-level attacking force. The destroyers could also target the cartel's submersibles. Of course, the U.S. could also rely on its submarines to do that. It has nearly 70 of them, none of which it'll have to use to their full capacity. A single torpedo from one of those submarines could easily sink any of the ships or submersibles in the cartel's navy. The only issue for the U.S. Navy lies in properly identifying the vessels that the cartel uses to transport its drugs. It can't just fire torpedoes at cargo ships and yachts because it assumes that they carry cartel drugs. So America would instead use its Navy to create a full blockade. Ships would be packed into the Gulf of America, formerly Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of California. America would like to do the same in the Caribbean Sea, though it would face opposition from Cuba and Honduras there. Instead, it creates a blockade near the Yucatan Channel, just far enough away from Cuba so it's outside of the country's waters. The U.S. also stations more ships in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, ensuring that none of the cartel ships can circumvent blockades that are closer to Mexico's territory. For now, the U.S. has built a naval blockade around Mexico as its ground forces surround and assault cartel strongholds. There's only one more thing the cartels have in their arsenals that the U.S. has to handle: aircraft. As is the case with their sort of but not quite Navy, the cartels have also had a pretty impressive fleet of planes. Back in 2016, Vice reported that Mexican authorities had seized almost 600 planes and helicopters linked to the massive Sinaloa cartel alone between 2006 and 2015. At the time, that was 5 times the size of Aeromexico's fleet, and it likely is that the cartel still has planes they use to transport drugs away from Mexico. Those aircraft include Cessnas, which Vice says are the most popular among the cartels, along with Pipers, Gulfstreams, and several others. These planes are owned by shell companies and private airlines, making them legal, at least to the letter of the law. In 2016, the Sinaloa cartel alone also operated close to 4,800 secret airstrips, each being between 1,600 and 3,300 feet long. It's all very impressive, at least for a drug transportation operation. But none of those planes offer anything in terms of attacking prowess. The U.S. Air Force, on the other hand, well, the Air Force has a massive stock of 13,000 aircraft. Almost 1,800 of those aircraft are fighters, with almost 900 being the attack type. The U.S. also has 900 fixed-wing transports, which it'll be able to use to shuttle its troops anywhere in Mexico with the help of the government. It also has a tanker fleet of 600. These tankers are essentially aerial refueling stations that the U.S. can use to keep its fighters and attack types, such as bombers, up in the air for even longer before they have to touch down at a base. Throw in 5,800 helicopters and 1,000 attack choppers, and it's not even a competition. The cartels have practically no aerial power. The U.S. would dominate the skies. However, don't expect the U.S. to start carpet-bombing cartel strongholds from the air. We mentioned earlier that these strongholds are usually in towns and cities, meaning aerial assaults would present too much of a risk to regular Mexican citizens. The U.S. could use its Air Force to take out isolated fortifications, but it's generally unlikely to use its Air Force to attack land targets. It will, however, use it to target the cartel's planes and clandestine airstrips. The U.S. already has spy planes in the skies near the Mexican border, according to CNN. Between the end of January and the beginning of February 2025, those planes flew at least 18 special missions, all designed to help America identify cartel targets near its border with Mexico. Previously, the surveillance missions were limited to about 1 per month. Now, with the U.S. having the Mexican government's full approval to go after the cartels, those spy planes are a constant in the skies above Mexico. They spend the war hunting for the cartel's hidden landing strips. Whenever one's found, the call goes into a fighter jet or a bomber and the strip is bombed into oblivion. It's a safe option. Destroying the landing strips ensures the cartel can't get any of its aircraft into the skies. It also means the U.S. Air Force doesn't have to risk attacking Cessnas and similar small aircraft that could just be flown by innocent civilians. Combine this tactic with ramping up security at Mexico's airports, ensuring that all private planes are checked by the U.S. military before they can take to the skies, and the cartels are essentially grounded. All they have left are maybe a few dozen helicopters, and they aren't going to do much when stacked against the far more numerous and advanced choppers of the U.S. Air Force. By now, the war between the U.S. military and the Mexican cartels is starting to look like an easy American victory, even with the U.S. holding back its full forces to preserve civilian life. It's successfully attacking strongholds, has instituted a naval blockade, and controls the skies over Mexico. Is there anything the cartels can do to fight back? The short answer is yes, sort of. Money is the one thing the cartels have in abundance. How much they collectively have is up for debate. In 2019, Senator David Perdue claimed that the cartel business is a multi-billion-dollar industry during a hearing of the Senate International Narcotics Caucus. At $500 billion, $500 billion, that makes the cartel's business and the drug traffic just in Mexico alone coming into the United States bigger than Walmart. To put it in perspective, so this is larger than our largest companies, claimed the senator. That number was reverse engineered, essentially amounting to an assumption based on the street values and consumption rates of narcotics in the U.S. Other estimates at the time placed the figure between $6 billion and $29 billion, far less than Perdue claimed, but still an impressive sum of money the cartels could dedicate to their pseudo-military cause. More numbers came from Homeland Security Chairman Mark E. Green in July 2023. He claimed the cartels had made a record amount of money over the previous 2 years, though his numbers were nowhere near Perdue's. According to Green, in 2021 alone, The cartels made an estimated $13 billion just from human trafficking and smuggling. While the numbers are up in the air, we can at least assume the cartels are drawing in several $billion per year. Most of these numbers are nowhere near the $850 billion the US spent on defense in 2024. Even if the $500 billion number is accurate, the cartels still fall around $350 billion behind. However, that cartel money creates opportunities. The cartel can purchase more weapons than they have right now, assuming that they could maintain a flow of black market firearms into Mexico. They can also use that money to bribe local officials, police officers, and, if they somehow manage to find some weak links, members of the US military. Money goes a long way in any war, and the cartels will use theirs to fortify and protect themselves at all costs. That's why the US needs to tackle the cartel money problem. Stopping the flow of money to the cartels would also be another reason for a US naval blockade. Given that 95% of the cartel's drugs are shipped via the water into the United States, having a naval blockade in place basically cuts off the cartel's primary source of funds. The gangs will still have cash, but it'll be a finite amount that they can't increase through more drugs and human trafficking. The US military would also go after the sources of this income. The same spy planes that are searching for cartel landing strips will also be on the lookout for drug manufacturing facilities. Soldiers on the ground will raid those facilities with the help of intelligence provided by Mexico's authorities. The US will also try to cut the flow of drugs into Mexico. The US State Department believes that 90% of the cocaine that enters the US is made in Colombia before being transported through Mexico. Cutting off those supply lines would be key to the US military's approach. Taking out cartel strongholds damages the supply lines, and the Navy may extend the blockade to cover the South Pacific Ocean between Mexico and Hawaii to prevent waterborne shipments from Colombia. Checkpoints set up at the border between Mexico and Nicaragua would also slow the flow of cocaine into South Mexico. The US military's goal here is simple: starve out the cartels. Cutting off the flow of cash into the gangs causes havoc. As the money dries up, there are more chances for gang members to turn on one another, revealing key pieces of intelligence. This would allow the US military to conduct more raids and take out the head honchos of the various cartels. So the US would have a plan to deal with cartel funding. However, it faces a much more dangerous issue. The cartels are prepared for a fight, and they won't use standard military tactics. As much as the US might want to characterize the cartels as loose gangs focused solely on money, the reality is that the violence the cartels engage in hasn't come from nowhere. Many of these gangs have taken a militarized approach to their tactics and training. Editor of Illicit Tactical Progress, Mexican Cartel Tactical Notes, 2013 to 2020, Robert J. Bunker lays this out. He says, military standoff munitions, rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, and 40mm type rifle grenades have been well integrated into the cartel arsenals. Enforcers or foot soldiers are increasingly wearing body armor, combat harnesses, and carrying assault rifles. The cartels are also adept at using improvised explosive devices. Some cartels have even created training academies designed to teach military tactics and desensitize new members to the violence they'll face on the streets. This training and equipping of the cartels means they're primed to engage in a guerrilla warfare campaign against the US. Though the US will experience plenty of success in taking out strongholds, destroying airfields, and cutting off the cartel's cash flows, much of the fighting will involve guerrilla tactics. Cartel members can blend into the local Mexican population when they want to, making it much harder for US forces to determine who is and isn't a member when they don't have a clear positive ID on their targets. The cartels can use this to create booby traps and ambushes. The cartels would also use divide and conquer strategies, attacking small and separated American units to limit the US military's effectiveness. Some are even starting to classify the cartels as hybrid organizations that use narco-terrorism to get what they want. That is an issue the US military has to counter, because it comes back to the fear factor we mentioned earlier. Cartel members will try to blend into local populations, all while terrorizing regular people into being so fearful that they can control them. That control leads to less information being given to the US military and even potential protection of cartel members by average citizens. Add corruption into the mix, and the cartel's guerrilla tactics provide an even sturdier defense. December 2023 saw Mexican authorities arrest over 100 local police officers across 2 states for rioting and abuse of authorities. The cartels take advantage of this local police corruption to serve as a protective shield. With the billions of dollars the cartels have at their disposal, they could bribe members of local law enforcement to feed the US military inaccurate intelligence. It would make it harder for America to track these cartel members down. America's approach of cutting off the billions the cartels generate would have a clear effect on these guerrilla tactics. However, there is something else the US military could use to destroy this cartel game plan. And the key lies in the word cartels. There's no such thing as a single overarching Mexican cartel. There are many gangs, with the two largest being the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Other major players include Los Zetas, the Beltran Leyva organization, the Gulf cartel, the Juarez cartel. And all of these gangs fight each other regularly over territory as they attempt to expand, with that infighting being key to the late stage of the war between the US military and the cartels. Guerrilla warfare tactics involve small groups of cartel soldiers attacking US forces, but there still needs to be a hierarchy. Who would lead the cartels in their fights against the US? That's the impossible question the cartels would need to answer, with the odds being that having so many gang leaders trying to take control would lead to chaos at the top. While the US focuses on taking out airstrips, destroying strongholds, and stopping the flow of cash into the cartels, it'll just need to wait out the cartels' attempts to organize. With so many warring factions trying to work together, it may not be the US military that ultimately spells the end of the cartels. It would be the cartels themselves as they try to cooperate. Even if the cartels do manage to organize themselves, it won't be enough. The US bringing its entire military to the fight would devastate the gang's rank-and-file foot soldiers. Strongholds would disappear, the flow of drugs and cash would end. As for the cartel leaders, the failure of the guerrilla tactics would lead to them being hunted down one by one, putting an end to the cartels in Mexico. Would the US military steamroll the cartels, or would the cartels' tactics and terrain make the fight more difficult than expected? Could a full-scale invasion actually end cartel influence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out most brutal torture methods by Mexican cartels, or click on this video instead.